At 3:41 a.m. local time, 8 Ukrainian sea drones were already at full speed across the Black Sea, divided into 2 attack groups and converging on Novorossiysk from different angles. Less than 25 kilometers ahead, the harbor was still dark. Inside it sat Admiral Makarov and Admiral Essen, along with missile ships, patrol vessels, submarine support facilities, and the infrastructure Russia depended on to keep part of its Black Sea fleet armed and operational. The distance was falling quickly. The first 4 sea drones were approaching from the southwest. The second group was farther south, opening the attack across a wider stretch of water instead of following the same path toward the harbor entrance. That forced the first decision on the Russian side before a single weapon had reached the port. Coastal surveillance began separating the contacts. Harbor security crews were alerted. Weapons covering the approaches started turning toward the water. Then another set of tracks appeared. 12 Ukrainian Palyanytsya long-range strike drones were coming toward Novorossiysk from the west, higher and farther back than the sea drones. They were not arriving at exactly the same time. The surface contacts were pulling coastal weapons toward the water. Above them, a second set of tracks was beginning to fill the air defense picture. Within minutes, Novorossiysk had gone from routine night operations to a defense spreading across sea and sky. And the stakes inside the harbor were much larger than 8 unmanned boats. Russia had shifted valuable naval assets farther east as Crimea became harder to protect. Novorossiysk was supposed to give those ships distance, more warning, more defensive depth, more time. Ukraine was now consuming all 3. The sea drones kept accelerating toward the outer approaches, while Russian crews prepared to engage them. Above the water, the Palyanytsya formation continued closing. Russia had begun fighting the attack it could see. The weapons meant for the most valuable targets were still outside the battle. At 3:46 a.m., the southwest group was less than 9 kilometers from Novorossiysk's outer approaches when the first Russian gun crews opened fire. The lead USV was hit almost immediately. Its wake hooked hard across the surface, then vanished beneath a white burst of water. A second boat was struck moments later and began losing speed. On the Russian side, the first problem suddenly looked smaller. 4 boats had become 2, but the southern group was still coming. Those 4 USVs were farther out and approaching on a different line, which meant the crews covering the harbor entrance could not simply turn everything toward the damaged group and finish it. Some of the harbor guns still had to remain trained south. Then, the air defense screens changed. The nearest Palyanytsya tracks had closed to roughly 11 kilometers west of the port. A Pantsir S-1 crew acquired the first one and fired. Seconds later, the contact disappeared. Another Palyanytsya began drifting away from its original heading as Russian electronic warfare pushed interference across the approach. Farther inland, a Tor M2 picked up a separate track and engaged it. Another contact was gone. For the crews inside Novorossiysk, this was the first moment the attack looked manageable. 2 sea drones were already out of the fight. Palyanytsya tracks were disappearing. The harbor itself was still untouched. Then, something stopped making sense. The Ukrainians were taking losses, but the attack itself was not changing. The 2 surviving USVs in the southwest kept driving forward. The southern group maintained its line. The remaining Palyanytsya did not scatter or turn back. Harbor guns were still working the water. Pantsir and Tor remained occupied overhead. Electronic warfare was still transmitting. Russia was winning the first exchanges, but Ukraine was behaving as if losing those weapons had never changed the plan. At 3:50 a.m., 6 new contacts appeared west of Novorossiysk, while Russian crews were still fighting the sea drones and Palyanytsya, already inside the defensive picture. They were moving much faster. The USVs had been closing on the harbor at roughly 80 kilometers per hour. These new contacts were crossing the same battle space several times faster, low over the Black Sea, and tightening directly toward the naval berths. On Russian screens, the difference was immediate. Neptune, the first missile, was already inside roughly 8 kilometers of the western defense sector when a Panzer S-1 crew swung onto the track. That changed the rhythm of the fight. The sea drones had given Russian crews minutes to watch, fire, and correct. Neptune was taking that time away. The range dropped through 7 kilometers, then 6. The Panzer launcher fired. Its interceptor climbed hard from the coast and crossed above the water, while the Neptune continued straight in, eating hundreds of meters every few seconds. For a moment, both tracks were still moving. Then they merged. A flash opened over the sea. Burning fragments fell short of the harbor. One Neptune was gone, but the engagement had consumed seconds. Russia did not get back. While Panzer finished that intercept, the other 5 missiles had continued closing. The surviving Palyanytsya were still keeping Tor, and other short-range defenses occupied overhead. Down at the harbor entrance, 2 USVs were still pressing from the southwest, while 4 more remained on the southern approach, forcing gun crews to stay on the water. The first 2 threats had not disappeared, and now the third was moving faster than either of them. 5 Neptune missiles were still coming, closer than they had been when the first engagement began. For the first time that night, every successful Russian interception was buying less time than the next threat was taking away. By 3:53 a.m., 5 Neptune missiles were still closing on Novorossiysk, and Russian commanders had little choice but to give them priority. A second Panzer S-1 shifted onto the nearest missile track. The range was already below 7 kilometers when it fired. The interceptor caught the Neptune over the water. 4 remained. At almost the same moment, a Tor M2 destroyed another Palyanytsya approaching from the west. Russian defenses were still working. Missiles were leaving launchers, tracks were disappearing, and the harbor had not been opened completely. But every time one Russian crew finished a track, another was already demanding a decision somewhere else. The Ukrainian layers were now holding different parts of the defense in place. The southern USVs kept the breakwater guns pointed seaward. The surviving Palyanytsya kept Tor and part of the short-range defense looking west. That left the Neptunes arriving into a picture Russia could still fight, but no longer simplify. Then the gaps between the threats disappeared. One Neptune was already inside roughly 5 kilometers. A Palyanytsya was crossing toward the military side of the port. The southern USVs were still moving on the breakwater. None of those problems could wait. Inside the harbor, crews aboard Admiral Makarov and Admiral Essen brought their own sensors and defensive systems fully online. Now the ships were tracking threats for themselves. Russia still had weapons. What it no longer had was a clean sequence in which to use them. For several dozen seconds, every major threat demanded attention at the same time. One Neptune crossed beyond the last engagement that had been meant to stop it. A surviving Palyanytsya was still moving toward fixed infrastructure. The window had opened. At 3:55 a.m., the Neptune that had crossed the last engagement was already over the inner harbor. Admiral Essen lay ahead near the naval berths, with the breakwater behind it and the military side of the port stretching farther east. The missile stayed low until the final seconds. Then, the impact came. The blast reached the section of the frigate around equipment associated with its caliber capability. Flame pushed upward through the dark, followed by a heavier column of smoke drifting across the berth. The ship was still afloat. That did not mean it was still fully usable. A caliber carrier does not have to sink to leave the firing cycle. Damage around the launch-related systems can be enough to turn a missile ship into a repair problem. Russian crews were still reacting around Essen when the next reported damage appeared on Admiral Makarov. This time, the damage picture centered on the aft superstructure, around radar and antenna equipment. Damage was also visible around the upper section of the ship, where those systems are concentrated. Now the attack was no longer concentrated on one hull. A surviving Palyanytsya continued deeper toward fixed infrastructure on the military side of the port and detonated near the support area behind the berths. The battlefield had widened. Smoke was now rising from separate points inside the harbor. Gunfire was still coming from the approaches. Defensive systems were still searching for surviving tracks over the water and coastline. And behind the 2 frigates, sat more of the fleet's infrastructure. The area connected to the Buyan M missile ship, Vasily Bykov, the 4th Submarine Brigade berths, and other naval support facilities later included in Ukraine's damage claims. By then, Russia had already destroyed or disrupted a large part of the raid, but the weapons that survived were no longer crossing empty water. They were reaching Kaliber ships, sensors, and the infrastructure that kept those ships in the fight. The question was no longer how many weapons Ukraine had lost. It was how much of Novorossiysk's naval function those few survivors had interrupted. By first light, the attack had moved into a different phase. The shooting was largely over. Now Russian crews had to determine what could still operate. Damage control teams were working around the naval berths. Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov required technical inspection, particularly around areas associated with Kaliber systems, radar equipment, and antennas. If those systems had been damaged deeply enough, the ships did not need to sink to disappear from the immediate firing cycle. They only needed to become unreliable. The disruption had already spread beyond the warships. A grain terminal at the Novorossiysk food processing complex, linked to roughly 12% of Russia's grain exports, suspended operations. Military areas around the submarine berths and support facilities also had to be checked before normal activity could resume. That was where the asymmetry became visible. Ukraine had committed expendable sea drones, long-range Palyanytsya, and 6 Neptune missiles. Russia had answered with harbor guns, electronic warfare, Pantsir, Tor, shipboard defenses, and crews across the port. Many Ukrainian weapons had been destroyed. Russia still had to inspect an entire naval complex. And the cost was not only repair time. If Novorossiysk could be reached this way, Russia could no longer treat concentration as protection. Warships would have to disperse more carefully. Air defense systems would have to remain tied to the port. Every Kaliber carrier returning to Novorossiysk would also concentrate another high-value asset inside the same defended space. Those defensive assets could not be somewhere else. That mattered because Novorossiysk had become one of the places Russia increasingly relied on as pressure around Crimea grew. Moving ships east was supposed to create distance, warning time, and protection. The raid challenged all three. Ukraine had not erased Novorossiysk from the map. It had erased the assumption behind it, that moving the Black Sea Fleet farther from Crimea had moved it beyond Ukraine's reach. After this raid, would you still call Novorossiysk a safe haven for Russia's Black Sea Fleet?